Good morning and welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John and this is my partner, Smiles. And we're going to talk about the Jesus myth today, but not in the way you think. I'm not debunking the Jesus mythicists. I'm welcoming them to the table and offering them a coffee and a bagel. So that and more after this. And Poe's medium today looks like it is colored markers
and crowns.
and crayons. And we'll check in on Poe throughout the show. We are in a series called Starting Over, and it's directed towards those who are going through deconstruction, who have trust issues with the typical church, or maybe the Western church, Christian evangelicalism. It's not simply for those who are former evangelicals. I mean, we are open here to everyone with ears to ear. Ears to ear? I haven't had enough coffee. Ears to hear. Whether that be somebody who doesn't believe, doesn't have a faith belief, considers himself an atheist or agnostic, or somebody who has come out of the Christian faith, somebody who's in the Christian faith who may have a child or a sibling or a husband or wife who's gone through deconstruction, maybe even deconverted. So these are the conversations that we've been having lately. And I think the solution to all this is really what my father used to call occupation with Christ. My mother used to call occupation with Christ, and focusing on Jesus. And I do think that the church has done an awful job with the Jesus thing. Part of that is the different theologies that have taken prominence, especially in American evangelicalism. Part of that is bibliolatry, elevating the Bible to the level of the Godhead. So it's become the fourth member of the Godhead. So we talk about, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Bible. And so there have been obstacles thrust in the way of people, and some people have walked away over it. Some people have seen how flimsy it is, how it's a house of cards. So starting over last week, I said one of the keys, I think, to restoring some kind of relationship, some kind of place where we can have a common ground, where we can have conversations that aren't, the typical apologist versus atheist conversation is simply finding a place where we all have common ground, or we all can agree, and talking about reintroducing Jesus into that conversation. And so last week we talked about the minimal Christ, how we are trying to remove all the non-essential things so that we can at least have a clear view of Jesus Christ and weigh him and see what we think. Today I want to focus on the words of Christ. And so I'm going to be dismissing a lot of things that atheists dismiss for the sake of argument. For example, miracles. And I'd say this to Christians who like to focus on miracles, like to point out that Jesus walked on the water, or he healed the sick, and he, gave sight to the blind, or he fed the 5,000, these kind of things that make some unbelievers just roll their eyes like, wow, you believe in fairy tales. I want to say this to you who think that that's a good arrow to pull out of your quiver in an apologetic kind of talk. Miracles are only meaningful to those present to see them. Miracles are only effective to those who actually witness them, right? So if you were actually at the wedding of Cana and you saw we ran out of wine and people are starting to drink water and murmur, and you saw the water turn into wine, you tasted it and it was good. If you actually saw Jesus walk on the water, if you actually had a cousin with leprosy who was restored to you. That is meaningful to the people who are present. To the people who aren't present, it's not meaningful at all, because even my Christian friends dismiss outrageous stories that they hear from other faith traditions or even from non-faith traditions. Most Christians don't believe in little green men flying UFOs or even in Bigfoot or stuff like that. Or if somebody's raised from the dead, they question it. And they definitely question it when they hear somebody saying outside the Christian tradition that says that they had heard from God, right? They even question some people within the Christian tradition who say they've heard from God. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But what do I mean about focusing on the words of Jesus and not necessarily the works or the miracles? If you are not in a believing position, you aren't going to be moved by these stories necessarily. So what makes Jesus Jesus apart from those things? Now, I will throw this out there. You know, if you tune in, if let's say you're an objective outsider who hasn't made a decision yet, and you tune in to the kerfuffle that is Christians versus atheists, that is, YouTube apologists versus YouTube atheists, you'll find that the majority of the discussion typically is spent on things like the resurrection. Christians have been painted into a corner on certain topics, and they hold on to them like a dog with a bone. And so Christians believe, something that Paul was said to have written, that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it's all meaningless. Now, I got to say to you here, and I'm going to say it, and it's going to strike you maybe as odd, because I'm disagreeing with the Apostle Paul, or at least with the Bible here. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that if Jesus Christ didn't rise from the dead, that none of what he did or said is meaningful, and we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. I don't believe that statement is a good statement. So, if you're tuning out now because I challenged Paul or challenged the Bible, I would ask you out of curiosity to hang in there. But what I will say to you is that if you're arguing about the resurrection with somebody, again, miracles are meaningful to those who witness them. If somebody is rejecting Christianity because they don't believe that people can be raised from the dead, here's what you're going to miss in that conversation if you start at resurrection and you don't start where I'm suggesting, simply with the Jesus myth. You're going to basically miss everything Jesus did and said. You're going to erase that from the conversation if you start with resurrection with somebody. And frankly, I would suggest to most Christians that they've never really considered Jesus from, forgive me, the ground up. They start with the resurrected Christ seated next to the Father or ascending into heaven, and they kind of have the life of Christ in the rearview mirror, and they rarely visit it. It's kind of like a place you moved away from and you never go back to visit, unless it's a wedding or a funeral. So here's what I want to say to you. I think that we miss a lot when we start there, when we start with an argument over the resurrection, especially with people who aren't fellow believers. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's unnecessary. I think in a way it's quite foolish. Now, let me just give you a little bit about my background so you understand that I came out of a tradition that was theologically dispensational. Dispensational is a way to categorize the Bible, to try and understand it. It's just one of those other isms that's trying to make sense of a library that doesn't necessarily agree. The authors don't necessarily agree, and there's contradictions. So dispensationalism looks at an unsolvable Rubik's Cube, which is what the Bible is, and they want to solve it. They want to make sure that all the red is on one side, all the green on one side, all the white on one side, all the blue on one side. And to do that, in some cases, they have to peel off stickers to make it work. Because it doesn't work, because the Bible doesn't work that way. But dispensationalism is a tool to try and make sense of a Bible where you find those contradictions and where you find those things that don't actually work together. And so I've come out of that tradition. Now, in that tradition, Jesus Christ is a second-class citizen. It's just true. People that are dispensationally based, focused on the Pauline epistles. And when I was in this system, I'd tell you that's not true. We focus on the risen and glorified Christ, and Paul's message is Christ's message. And that we believe that all of the Bible is for us, but the Pauline epistles are to us and about us. And we would say to you that they complement, Paul's teaching complements that of Christ. But we've really spent no time studying the person and work of Christ or even the Gospels. As a matter of fact, my father, who preceded me in the pulpit at the church where I taught for 20-some years, he taught, the last two books he taught before he retired were the Gospel of John and Hebrews, and there was a church split over it because, I don't know if you know this, Paul didn't write the Gospel of John, and some people don't believe he wrote Hebrews. And even if he wrote Hebrews, he wrote it to Hebrews and not us. So there was a church split over this because my father dared to, teach something outside of the Pauline epistles. Not only that, but when my brother took my mother to Israel on a vacation, people knew that my brother was going to take my mom to Israel, and one person in the church said to her, or actually a number of people, from what I've heard, said to her, why would you want to go to Jerusalem? Why would you want to go to where Jesus walked? Why wouldn't you want to go to where Paul walked? Visit all those churches that are buried under rubble in Turkey. As much as we'd like to deny it, my father used to say that he was Pauline, but he wasn't a Paulist. But virtually everyone I met around him, they were all Paulists, and they'd all scoff if you were doing a Bible study in Matthew or something like that. And here's what that person misses. When you're a dispensationalist like that, you dismiss even the greatest sermon ever taught, the Sermon on the Mount. You say, well, that's not for us. Jesus didn't, that was for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or that's for the future kingdom where we're going to be in heaven and Jews will be here on earth. And so we would have so many excuses to hide and ignore and downplay and mute the very voice of Jesus Christ, who we are told is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. So I want to strip all that away from you. If you've come from the same background as me, I want to suggest that you be brave enough to set that aside for a moment. I want you to think of somebody you love dearly, who's on the other side of the fence, who doesn't accept anything that you accept, and you are starting from ground zero. You're starting from scratch to introduce them to the person of Jesus Christ. And what do we find about him? Now, I need to start here with a very important point, and that is a point that we went over when we were talking about the Bible. And that is, people think that we know of Jesus because of the Bible, because of the Gospels. John, the Gospel of John, of Matthew, of Mark, and of Luke, and of course of Paul's writings. I mean, we wouldn't know about Jesus at all if it wasn't for the Bible. This is a very modern, and forgive me, ignorant view. This is a bibliolatry view. This is not historically accurate at all. As a matter of fact, it's fundamentally shameful if you actually go back to Jesus Christ. So let me say this, and apparently it's revolutionary for some. Jesus made the Bible. And when I say made, I don't mean he wrote it. I mean made it relevant. It's not the Bible that made Jesus relevant. Jesus made the Bible relevant. Stay with me and tell me where you see a hole in this argument. First of all, without Jesus, there is no Bible. Jesus didn't exist or didn't come, as Christians believe. There's no New Testament, because the New Testament is inspired by the person and the work and the hope of Jesus Christ. We all know that's true. Now, the only reason people know about the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, is because it was bound together with the New Testament, and it became the bestseller in the world because of Jesus. As a matter of fact, without Jesus, if we do It's a Wonderful Life and we take Jesus as the George Bailey person, there is no Bible. There's a very small minority of Jewish weirdos who know what the Bible is, or who know what the Hebrew Scriptures are. And the New Testament never exists. And it's not the best-selling book in the world. It rises to the relevance of about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That's where the Bible would be today if Jesus didn't make it relevant. And having said that, the early church grew without a Bible for 300 some years. And more than that, the church grew without a Bible for over 1,000 years because it wasn't relevant until after the printing press. And more than that, it wasn't relevant until people were literate and until glasses were invented. So people like me who couldn't read a Bible right now without my glasses could read them. So there are a lot of different things that we don't consider going back in time. And we think the Bible made Jesus. Somebody has said this to me over and over again because they think I don't like the Bible or I criticize the Bible. I don't. I love the Bible. I just know that it wasn't produced by, put it this way, Moses didn't come down from Mount Sinai with 39 scrolls, and Jesus didn't come out of the tomb with 27, right? If you believe that's how the Bible, and most Christians, by the way, they might not believe something as silly as that, but they kind of believe that. They kind of believe that, God produced the Bible, and if he didn't write it himself, he dictated it, or he whispered it in the ears of men, or he allowed men to write it, and then the Holy Spirit came in and cleaned it up, kind of edited it, and inspired those who would edit it to take out the wrong words and leave in the right ones, and to take out the wrong books and leave in the right ones. So there's magical thinking that goes into this understanding of what the Bible only says of itself is that it's inspired by God. It doesn't say God wrote it. Doesn't say God dictated it. Doesn't say God edited it. This is all stuff men have put on it to give it more relevance, to use it and to manipulate and to say, my way is Yahweh, right? So now, removing all this, the moment you start arguing about the virgin birth, the feeding of the 5,000, or the resurrection, you've really started the conversation in the wrong place. And what do you lose? You lose the effect that Jesus had on his environment. Now wait a minute. You say, what about the Jesus myth people? They are a small corner of the world that believes that Jesus was a total myth, that he never really even existed. I'm willing to sit with them and talk about it, because if that's true, it's still the greatest myth ever told. and what's relevant about it? We could get into that later. But what I really want to suggest to you is that most people, and almost all academics, believe that Jesus did exist. And that maybe some of the details or some of the words or some of the events around his life have grown as legend as time passed. Fine. All right. I'm saying let's look at that Jesus. And when we go back to that Jesus, we find somebody who's not not very different than somebody like a Zorro or a Robin Hood, right? Now, I know people who hate talking about religion, hate talking about politics, because, frankly, they've been burned by it, they've stood too close to the stove, or they've seen relationships broken over it, and they have some childhood trauma over being in church and seen splits and seen people do the evil that men do in the name of God, and they don't want any part of it. I get that. I've also met the same people who won't go near a conversation about God or even about, elephants and donkeys, but they can talk your ear off, and they could talk for hours about the Marvel Universe or about Star Wars or, for that matter, about Shakespeare or, Dostoevsky. And there's a reason for this, and it's because that Homo sapiens sapiens, modern human beings, have some connection, a deep connection with story. Telling stories, with sharing stories, with hearing stories. It's stories that moves peaceful men to even pick up arms against their neighbor and go to war. It's stories that has warlike men laying down their arms, right? Stories are really an important function to human beings. And Christians have forgotten that we have a story. And it's a great story. And it's a powerful story. It's a story that has changed civilizations, that has altered history when it's done right. Now, like any powerful words, it could be used for good or evil. We've seen it used both ways. And there's been eras where it's been used more for evil than good. And that's why people who grew up sawing what the Catholic Church did to the Huguenots in France or what the Borgia popes were doing looked at it and said, yeah, no, I don't see God there. I see the opposite of God there. I see the devil inspiring stuff there, which often happens. That happens in our day with megachurch pastors or with celebrity Christians who behind the scenes live in like a son of Belial. And so that happens. But I want to say story is built into the very fabric of our being. It gets our attention. It can move us. And when Christians abandon that, when they abandon story because they think they can prove the resurrection, they think they can, in the insecurity and the overshadowing of the Enlightenment, they think they can give you a mathematical formula of fine-tuning and of different arguments that could reason you into the acceptance of Jesus Christ, that could argue you into the kingdom. And in that understanding, the modern apologetics understanding, they've dismissed faith for reason only. And the very, very startling irony of all this is these same apologists would mock the history of France when France, and they'd contrast the American Revolution with the French Revolution. Then they'd say, here's where the French went wrong is they divorced themselves from faith and just concentrated on reason, which is basically something that every modern apologist does when they think they could talk you into belief with reason, with arguments. And we've neglected story and the power of the story of the person of Jesus. I want to share something with you real quick. It's from a friend on the internet, wrote something recently. He oftentimes writes reflections of something that's happened to him, and I think this is a powerful one. It helps us come back to the story that is Jesus Christ. Jacob M. Wright, if you follow him on social media, said this recently over the past week. Once in a while, at a beautiful Episcopalian church that I attend, my eyes kept looking up to the crucifix, elevated at the center of the cathedral above the Eucharist table. And as the choir sang and the creeds were recited, I couldn't help but wonder at the weirdness of that. At the center of our faith is an executed man, a flayed man, a tortured man with hands and feet nailed to some wood, elevated as the symbol of our faith. Yes, it's weird. Think about it. But then keep thinking about it. Think about how much this is completely opposite of what humans usually worship. Power, prestige, beauty, talent, wealth, charisma. Definitely not a bloody, humiliated, tortured, executed man. And our gods have always been like this too. An almighty version of what we esteem as powerful and praiseworthy and what gets its way. The crucified man, elevated as the image of God, subverts and destroys this. It makes us rethink everything. It exalts humility and empathy. It glorifies self-giving love and forgiveness. It exposes pride and power, overturns violence, even victimization. Its foolishness and weakness subverts everything we ever elevated as wisdom and power, and there it is. An executed man, limbs outstretched, nailed down, hanging helplessly, uttering forgiveness. To partake in the Eucharist is to partake in this. Human history and all the kingdoms of the world were founded on domination and subjugation, and we are suddenly given an image of an executed man as God, and it begins to cause an upheaval in our thinking until the shalom, the peace of the Father, works itself out unto the reconciliation of all things. Jacob M. Wright. The crucified man, the image of a revolutionary truth. Jesus comes into a world, into a place and time where subjugated people were under the impression of the most powerful kingdom, empire that the world had ever known. And politics were more divisive than they are in today's America, and religion was more wrapped up in politics than they are in today's America. And Jesus comes into that shouting match between priest and publican. And it's a completely unique message. Now, some will say that, okay, the myth of Jesus or the Jesus legend, he didn't say anything. I've heard YouTube atheists say this. Jesus didn't say anything new. He didn't say anything different than what you can find in Confucius or in other faith systems. He's basically a golden rule guy. And it is true. There are similarities with some of the words of Jesus, and yet there are some things that are completely unique and revolutionary. And let's face it, you know, if he was simply like Confucius, would he have been crucified, really? If he had stopped at saying, love your neighbor, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you, would that have been enough to get him crucified? Crucifixion, I'm not going to focus too much on it, but it is another element in which virtually all academics agree that Jesus lived and he died at the order of Pontius Pilate. Now, we can argue about how some of the blank spaces in between those things fill out. Some people might say to me, well, you can't believe everything you read in the Gospels. Fine, but we get a flavor of who and what Jesus is. No one can argue that we don't. No one can argue that he was a party man. No one can argue that he didn't upset all of the power hierarchies surrounding him, from Jewish to Roman. No one could argue that this man we have named Jesus and the words and works we are given of him were completely in contrast to the Judaism of his day. His arguments were that the one true faith in his day had been subverted and corrupted by greed and racism. And so often he would tell stories making Israel's enemies the heroes of the stories, from Samaritan to centurion. Let's start there. Let's start with the myth of Jesus and work our way outward. I will say this to you, and here again, I disagree with Paul. Most people pin Christianity on the resurrection. By the way, even when I was a Christian in that manner, coming out of that tradition, Peyton was asked what's her faith background in school today. What do you say?
Christian, but it's complicated.
I'm a Christian, but it's complicated. That fits for me too. But when I came out of that world, I would have argued too that the resurrection is what makes you a Christian. When if you think about it deeply, and before I came out of that world, I started to think what a much bigger thing the incarnation is than the resurrection. It's infinitely bigger to think that God would become vulnerable. Did your thing go on? Oh. Mm-hmm. It's infinitely more intense to think that God would allow himself to be vulnerable, so much so that he become human, expose himself to a human-like existence, even a human death, and remain human from that point on. Now, I know the hypostatic union, he wasn't solely human, but that to me is much more unfathomable than God, who is the giver of life and who appoints death, just raising himself from the dead. I'm sorry, that just doesn't strike me as big. You know why it is big, though, in the mindset of human beings and of people who call themselves Christ followers? Because we believe that it was the resurrection that was necessary to give us life, to give us eternal life. And so in kind of an arrogant fashion, in kind of a self-serving fashion, we elevate the resurrection as the ultimate piece of the puzzle that is Christ and redemption, right? That if he hadn't died and risen again, we are of all men most miserable, as if nothing that happened before that held any value. So it's this kind of particularly narrow thinking in the retributive God, the penal substitutionary atonement type of God, that we cling to this idea that the resurrection. One of the things I admire about C.S. Lewis, when he came to accept Jesus Christ, he didn't believe in an afterlife. That took a little bit longer for him to change his mind on. He accepted Christ because of the story and the myth, and he found the beauty in it and the true and the good, without the idea of a get out of jail free card, without the idea of, either I'm going to burn in hell for eternity and I want to avoid that, so I'll pray the prayer, or the idea that if I pray the prayer, I'll be in the company of all those who have died before me and in singing the everlasting praises of an all holy God for the rest of eternity. He actually accepted Christ without believing in a tomorrow, in another life, in another world. And that, to me, carries with it a great deal of honor and import on how his thinking went. Because most Christians, I'm sorry, it becomes a fear-based thing. They don't want to spend eternity in hell, and they're not quite sure that, quite frankly, they have a much more refined definition of what hell is than they do what heaven is. They really don't want to go there. And who wants to be on the losing side when you could be on the winning side, even though you don't know what that means? And so I'm not, stay with me. I'm not disputing heaven and hell today. I just wanted to suggest to you that when we focus solely on the resurrection and what it means to us, right, that it's the tree of life, that we really are restored to the Garden of Eden and have access to the tree of life so that we could live forever. It's the fountain of youth. It is. I'm sorry. If you start there, you miss all the beauty and the effect and the prominence and just the fascinating person that is Jesus, whether you believe he's a myth or not. Now, I believe Jesus was more than myth, more than a legend. I believe it was an earth-shattering moment, and that's why we still feel the reverberations this far into time. Peyton said to me the other day, I don't know if you could see my tattoo. You probably can't. Which way do I have to lean? I've got a tattoo of Jesus on this arm. I'm leaning way over so you could see it. And we were in the drive-thru at the Wendy's the other day. And when we're there, I have my window down, my hands outside the window. And you could see my tattoo in my side view mirror. And Peyton looked at my tattoo and she said, wouldn't it be interesting if a guy who didn't know your faith tradition, a guy who didn't know about Christianity, saw your arm, he'd think you just have some guy on your arm, some dude on your arm. And, that would be interesting. But I said to Peyton, but almost nobody doesn't know. Jesus is an iconic figure. Almost nobody would not know what the symbol is. Almost nobody in the world would look at a crucifix or a cross and kind of not know. You'd have to look deep. And this is one of the things that amazes me about the Jesus story. There's a lot of people that could dismiss prophecy in the Bible. They'll say, these events were written after they happened, by the Babylonian exile generation, whatever. And you could dismiss nearly all of prophecy in the Bible, but there's some you can't. And one of the ones that I love, that is irrefutable, is the prophecy that little Mary made when she said, from this point on, every generation shall call me blessed. Now, even if you take a late date for the writing of Luke and the Gospels, I don't care. Taking a ridiculous date for that. If you think it was written in the 2nd century, great, fine. Is it true? People know the name of the mother of Jesus when they don't know the name of the mother of Buddha or of Zoroaster or of any of the others, the Emperor Hirohito or what have you. And that is something. That's not something you could just turn away from and scoff at. That's part of the legend. And that makes it a legend unlike any other. Do you know Robin Hood's mother? Do you know her name? How about Zorro's? How about, it just, we can go through the whole panoply. It's something that not only Jesus is known, but that figure of the Madonna with child, the figure of Christ on the cross. These things are known. They're widely known. That doesn't make the Christian story true. But it is something that makes you go, All right, I think we can stop here. I think we just finished in time because I think you just put down your pencil. Where are we at here? Let me see this one. So I'm going to go to this one in a second. Let me go to there. And we've got kind of a hat in the grass. A hat, a brown hat with a red band laying in the grass. Is there meaning to this painting, or did it just pop into your head?
I wanted to draw a hat.
What's that?
I wanted to draw a hat.
You wanted to draw a hat, but why a brown hat with a red banner? With that red?
It's a pretty hat.
It is. So somebody left their hat in the grass.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. That's all you got to say today? Nothing else?
Not really. I'm
How about-
tired today.
You are. It's been a long weekend. Folks, we hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We hope you stay with us as we continue our series on starting over. And listen, maybe something we've said will be of meaning to you. But we'll see you next week. We appreciate you watching, and we look forward to seeing you next week.